I have always known since I was little that love comes with conditions. Even at the age of 45, as I sit by my window watching the autumn leaves fall, I can still feel the difference from my childhood when my mother Diane's eyes were on my sister Vanessa instead of me, when her smile was directed at me compared to when it was not. There were stark differences in kindness, interest, and pride that even a small child could detect. Rebecca, you're strong, so you'll be fine. That was my mother's standard phrase, uttered while her attention was already drifting toward my sister. Strong? I would think to myself, feeling anything but. She used those words to keep me at a distance and justify treating only Vanessa as special. That label, strong, became both my armor and my prison. But after decades of life, I finally realized true family isn't just about blood relations. The revelation didn't come easily. It was earned through tears, disappointment, and eventual growth. What makes a family are the bonds formed from love, respect, and understanding, qualities I never found in my childhood home but discovered later in life. This is the story of my journey to find my true family. When I was 3 years old, my parents got divorced. First in my memory, my father Thomas and mother Diane were always arguing. It was a fragmented scene, but I vividly remember their voices filled with anger and sadness, echoing through our small house while I hid under my covers. Rebecca, your father and I can't live together anymore, my mother said, her face a mask of determination rather than sadness. But I will always be with you. That promise quickly faded like morning mist in sunlight. She took me back to her parents' house, and there she met Howard, who would become my stepfather. At first, he was kind to me, offering me candies and patting my head when my mother was looking. But when she turned away, his smile would vanish. Even as a child, I sensed the falseness in his attention. After my mother moved out over my grandmother's objections, I, as a child, had a bad feeling that settled in my stomach like a stone. But Mom, why can't we stay with Grandma? I asked, clutching my favorite teddy bear as the movers carried our belongings to Howard's house. Because we're starting a new life, Rebecca, she replied, not meeting my eyes. A better life. Soon after, my mother got remarried, my sister Vanessa was born, and my premonition proved right. Everything about our life changed, and the change was not in my favor. Vanessa's birth. Vanessa's birth marked a turning point in our family's history. I was only 4, but the day remains etched in my memory with painful clarity. Look, Rebecca, my mother showed baby Vanessa to me, her face glowing with a joy I rarely saw directed at me. This is your sister. Isn't she beautiful? Indeed, she was beautiful. Blonde fuzz and blue eyes, the same color as Howard's. I will never forget the expression that appeared on Howard's face at that moment. It was filled with pure joy and pride, an expression he never showed when looking at me with my black hair and brown eyes that reminded everyone I wasn't his biological child. Perfect, he murmured, cradling Vanessa with reverence. Our daughter is perfect, our daughter. The emphasis on our hung in the air like a wall between us. Even as a young child, I felt something was off about that phrase. I intuitively understood that I was not included in that sacred circle of our. For months, I became a forgotten presence in the house that was supposed to be my home. My mother and Howard were all about Vanessa. The living room walls that once held a few pictures of me were gradually replaced with countless photos of Vanessa's milestones. Mom, can you help me with my homework? I would ask, standing in the doorway of Vanessa's nursery, where my mother spent most of her time. Mom is busy right now became the refrain I heard day after day, sometimes accompanied by an irritated glance that made me feel like I was intruding. Vanessa's feeding time, Vanessa's bath time, Vanessa's bedtime. Everything revolved around Vanessa, while I learned to fade into the background, to be invisible, to be strong, as my mother always said. A forgotten birthday. As the new family structure formed, my place gradually shifted to the periphery. In the eyes of my mother and Howard, Vanessa was always the center of the family constellation. She was doll-like with golden hair and blue eyes, a mirror image of Howard, which only served to emphasize how much I didn't belong. On my 6th birthday, a week before Christmas, I woke up with the innocent excitement that only a child can feel. I had been dropping hints about a bicycle I'd seen in a store window, painted my favorite color of red. I came downstairs in my best dress, expecting some acknowledgement of my special day. My mother bought a small cake later that afternoon, placing it on the kitchen table with a distracted air. There were no decorations, no balloons, and no party. The reason, she explained while checking Vanessa's temperature, was that Vanessa had caught a cold. But can't we still have a small celebration? I asked, my voice small as I watched my mother's attention fixed on my sister. Rebecca, don't be selfish, Howard chided from the doorway. Your sister is sick. You should be more considerate. My present was a single book, not wrapped, just handed to me with a hasty, happy birthday from my mother as she rushed back to Vanessa's side. I retreated to my room and read that book from cover to cover, finding escape in its pages from the reality of my home life. However, a few months later, Vanessa's first birthday was an entirely different affair. The house was filled with balloons and gifts. Relatives and friends I barely knew crowded our living room, cooing over my sister while I stood in the corner, feeling like a stranger in my own home. You're big enough now that you don't need this kind of thing, my mother told me when she noticed my quiet observation of the festivities. Her dismissive words cut deeper than she knew, and I felt my heart crumple like paper in a fist. I had become like an accessory to my sister in the family drama, where Vanessa was the star and I was a silent supporting character expected to blend into the background. A glimmer of hope, but there was a slight glimmer in my life. The only one who truly saw my existence was my real father, Thomas. Even after the divorce, he continued to be involved with me, though his presence was like a shadow, there but not openly acknowledged in our house. He coordinated with my grandmother to meet me secretly, always finding ways to be part of my life despite my mother's attempts to erase him from it. He would attend school events that my mother never attended, sitting in the back row, his face beaming with pride when I received an award or performed in a play. I vividly remember the morning I met my father secretly in the park when I was 9 years old. The leaves were beginning to change color, painting the park in hues of amber and crimson. We sat on a bench tucked away in a quiet corner, safely hidden from the main paths where someone might recognize us together. He bought me ice cream, chocolate, my favorite, even though the autumn air was crisp and cool. His hands looked tired with calluses I hadn't noticed before. Later I would learn why. It's a secret from Mom. He winked, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that always made me feel safe. Despite the weariness evident in the shadows beneath his eyes, his smile was genuine. Why don't you come to see me? I asked, licking my ice cream and watching a squirrel dart across the path. The question had been burning inside me for years. His eyes clouded with sadness, like the sky before rain. Your mother won't let me, but I promise, Rebecca, he said, gently squeezing my shoulder. I'll be by your side as much as I can. I looked down at my shoes, gathering courage. Mom and Howard are always about Vanessa, I blurted out, the words tumbling from me like water breaking through a dam. They don't care about me. My voice caught on the last words, betraying the hurt I tried so hard to hide. My father hugged my shoulder then, pulling me close. The warmth of his embrace contrasted with the cool autumn air. You are a special child, Rebecca, my father said, his voice thick with emotion. Never doubt your own worth. His words became a small flame planted deep within my heart, warming me from the inside for many years, a light I could turn to during the darkest moments at home. In the silence of my room at night, I would often repeat his words to myself. You are special. You have worth. It was a truth I clung to when everything else told me otherwise. Academic refuge. From middle school, I found my place in academics. Studying became my refuge, a world where I could excel on my own terms, where my worth was measured by my efforts rather than by comparison to someone else. Immersing myself in textbooks allowed me to forget the loneliness at home, to escape into worlds of knowledge where I could be anyone, go anywhere. There I was special. I boasted the best grades in class and was recognized by the teachers who saw potential in me that my own family seemed blind to. Mrs. Bennett, my English teacher, often stayed after class to discuss books with me or recommend new titles that weren't on a required reading list. You have a gift for analysis, Rebecca, she told me once, returning an essay with a bright red A+ at the top. You see layers in these stories that many adults miss. In high school, surrounded by classroom walls adorned with college pennants and inspirational quotes, I began to dream of leaving home. While looking at university posters on the classroom walls, I imagined the free world that lay beyond, a place where I could reinvent myself, where no one would know me as Vanessa's sister or the quiet girl. I wanted to earn a scholarship to a prestigious university and start a new life, one where I would be valued for who I was, not dismissed for who I wasn't. I researched programs in literature and history, staying late in the school library to use their computers, filling out applications in secret. One evening at dinner, as Howard talked about Vanessa's latest dance recital, I mustered the courage to share my plans with my family. The words had been rehearsed in my mind 100 times, but they still caught in my throat as all eyes turned to me. Dreams dismissed, university? My mother frowned upon hearing my dream, her fork pausing midway to her mouth. The silence that followed felt heavier than the December snow piling up outside our windows. Where is the money for that? Howard is saving up for Vanessa's future. Community college should be enough for you. The dismissal stung like a slap. Vanessa was only 12, but a special account had already been set up for her future, a future deemed more valuable than mine. I glanced at Howard, who didn't even bother to look up from his plate. Vanessa has talent, my mother often said with pride shining in her eyes. She will surely become an artist. The implication hung unspoken in the air that I, by contrast, had nothing special to offer. But I've been working hard too, I weakly argued, hating the pleading note in my voice. My report card, straight as across the board, was still posted on the refrigerator, though half hidden behind Vanessa's crayon drawing. My teachers say I have potential for a scholarship. Howard scoffed, finally looking up. His eyes held that familiar coldness when they landed on me. Good grades alone won't get you through life, he said, waving his hand dismissively. Be realistic. Not everyone is college material. I nodded silently, pushing the food around my plate. I knew arguing was futile, like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. My dreams weren't even worth a proper discussion at this table. That night, alone in my room, I cried under the starry sky visible through my window as I felt my future dreams collapsing like a house of cards. The stars seemed so distant, so unreachable, just like my hopes of university. The tears came hot and fast, soaking into my pillow as I muffled my sobs with my hand, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of hearing me cry. A father's promise. When I met with my father over the weekend at our usual bench in the park, the words spilled out of me like a river breaking its banks. I told him about my dream of going to university, about wanting to study literature and history, about my longing for campus life where I could finally belong. I described the reaction of my mother and Howard, the casual dismissal that hurt more than outright rejection. Thomas listened silently, his face growing more serious with each word. The lines around his eyes deepened as I spoke, his hands clasped tightly together. When I finally fell silent, exhausted by my own emotions, he looked at me with such intensity that I felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long while. You should go to university, he said with quiet certainty. Not, you can try, or maybe someday, but a statement of fact, as if there was no question about it. But the money? I asked, voicing the practical concern that had been hammered into me by my mother and Howard. Don't worry, he said, reaching out to squeeze my hand. His palm was rough with calluses I hadn't noticed before. I'll figure something out. You focus on those grades and scholarship applications. I wanted to believe his words, to let hope flutter to life in my chest. But my father was not wealthy. After the divorce, he ran a small bookstore filled with worn paperbacks and the smell of aging paper. He led a modest life in a small apartment above his shop. I couldn't see how he could afford the tuition for university when he sometimes wore the same sweater for years until it frayed at the elbows. In my final year of high school, I studied desperately to win a scholarship, staying up late into the night, sacrificing weekends and social events. The effort paid off partially. I managed to secure a partial scholarship to the university of my dreams, but it wasn't enough to cover everything. Amidst my disappointment, I was close to giving up, to accepting the community college fate that Howard and my mother had laid out for me like an inevitability. A life-changing gift. One day close to graduation, my father took me to a quiet cafe downtown, away from our usual meeting places. The cafe was small and cozy, with jazz playing softly in the background and the rich aroma of coffee filling the air. Thomas seemed nervous, repeatedly running his hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from my own moments of anxiety. There, in a corner booth away from other patrons, he handed me an envelope, his eyes watching my face with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Rebecca, this is for you. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was enough money for me to attend a prestigious university for 4 years. Tuition, housing, books, everything. The amount was staggering. A small note was also included, handwritten in my father's neat script. For your dreams. I'm proud of you. Dad. How did you? I gasped, looking up at him in disbelief, the check still clutched in my shaking hands. He smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling, and explained he had been working 2 jobs for many years, saving up for my sake. In addition to the bookstore, he had worked as a taxi driver at night, spending hours on the road while I slept safely in my bed, never knowing the sacrifice he was making. Why go to such lengths? I asked tearfully, finally understanding the reason for the constant fatigue I'd noticed in his face, the calluses on his hands that hadn't come from shelving books. My father smiled gently, reaching across the table to brush a tear from my cheek. You have potential, Rebecca. You need a place to let it blossom. Tiredness was visible in his eyes, the kind that comes from years of double shifts and missed sleep, but it was overshadowed by his strong affection, a love that asked for nothing in return. At that moment, with the noise of the cafe fading into the background, I felt my father's unconditional love wash over me like a warm tide. He had made sacrifices for my happiness without seeking anything in return, without requiring me to be someone I wasn't, without comparing me to anyone else. In his eyes, I was enough just as I was. Confrontation. When I returned home, I walked in with a new confidence, the envelope tucked safely in my bag. The house was quiet except for the sound of the television in the living room. Taking a deep breath, I walked in to tell my mother and Howard about my decision to go to university. I've decided to attend Westfield University in the fall, I announced, my voice steadier than I expected. I got accepted with a partial scholarship. They looked up, surprised and visibly displeased. Howard muted the television, his expression darkening like a storm cloud. How will you get the money? My mother asked, her eyebrows drawing together in that familiar look of disapproval. She sat straighter on the couch as if physically bracing herself against my announcement. Dad will help me, I answered, and her face clouded over immediately. The mention of Thomas always had that effect, as if I'd spoken a forbidden name. Thomas? My mother's voice took on a bitter edge. That man can't afford it. He runs that dusty little bookshop that barely keeps him afloat. She shook her head dismissively, not even attempting to hide her disdain. He's been saving up for years for me. Working 2 jobs, I explained, feeling a surge of pride in my father's dedication. He was a taxi driver at night all this time. My mother's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. Howard snorted from his armchair, not bothering to hide his skepticism. He's just putting on airs, Howard said, his voice dripping with condescension. You'll be let down in the end. That man has never been reliable. Their words, meant to crush my spirit, only strengthened my resolve. For the first time in my life, I made my own decision without seeking their approval or cowering under their judgment. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and deciding to spread my wings. I'm going, I said simply. I've already accepted. That was the turning point in my life, the moment I chose myself and my future over their expectations and limitations. On the day I entered university, Thomas was there to see me off, his face glowing with pride as he helped carry my luggage to the dormitory. My mother and Howard did not come, citing Vanessa's dance recital as the reason, but that was no longer a pain for me. I had expected their absence, and in a way, it was a relief not to have their shadow cast over this new beginning. I was filled with the joy of new possibilities, standing at the threshold of a world that was about to open up to me. Dad, thank you, I said as I hugged him goodbye, breathing in his familiar scent of old books and aftershave. The words seemed inadequate for the gift he had given me, not just the money, but the belief in my worth. Live your own life, Rebecca, and call me sometimes, he replied, his eyes suspiciously bright. This is your time now. We laughed together, a shared moment of pure happiness that needed no further words. At that moment, I realized a true parent isn't just someone who is there at convenient times. It's someone who believes in me when no one else does, who sees my potential when others are blind to it, who makes sacrifices without keeping score. University life. At university, I discovered myself for the first time. Free from the shadow of comparison and neglect, I blossomed like a flower finally receiving sunlight after years in the shade. I studied literature and history with a hunger that surprised even me, my world expanding with each book I read, each lecture I attended. The campus became my sanctuary, the libraries with their endless rows of books, the quad where students gathered to debate philosophy under ancient oak trees, the dormitory where I formed friendships based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than obligation. I worked part-time in the university library while dedicating myself to my studies. The library, with its hushed atmosphere and the comforting smell of books, felt more like home than the house I'd grown up in ever had. Between the tall shelves and quiet reading nooks, I found peace that had eluded me for most of my life. That's where I met Nathan. He always visited the library at the same time every day, his arms full of books about environmental issues and sustainable practices. From my position at the checkout desk, I watched him over the weeks, his serious expression as he read, the way he carefully took notes, the occasional smile that transformed his face when he discovered something interesting. I was gradually drawn to his genuine passion and warm smile. There was something refreshingly authentic about him. He seemed comfortable in his own skin, unburdened by pretense or the need to impress others. After weeks of exchanging smiles and brief conversations about the books he was borrowing, I finally gathered my courage and asked him if he'd like to get coffee sometime. His surprised but pleased expression gave me a flutter of hope. "You want to know about me?" Nathan asked with a slight embarrassment when we sat down at the campus coffee shop the next day. He stirred his coffee nervously, as if unused to being the center of attention. "I'm a garbage collector," he said, watching my face carefully for a reaction. I was momentarily surprised. I had assumed he was an environmental science student, but quickly smiled. "So?" I replied, genuinely curious rather than put off. "Tell me more about that." Nathan seemed relieved by my reaction, his shoulders visibly relaxing. "Most people are put off by it, but I'm proud of my job. I'm making the environment cleaner every day," he said, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm as he began to explain his work. "Actually, I manage my family's waste collection company. We're developing new recycling methods that could revolutionize the industry." I was captivated by his frankness and pride in work that many would look down upon. There was no pretense with Nathan, no hidden agenda, just genuine passion and integrity. As our coffee date extended into dinner, and dinner into a walk under the stars, I felt something I'd rarely experienced before, the joy of being truly seen and accepted for who I was. A real family. Nathan's family was just as warm and welcoming as he was. The first time he invited me to Sunday dinner at his parents' home, I was nervous. My experiences with family gatherings had left me wary and defensive, expecting judgment or indifference. Instead, I walked into a house filled with laughter and the smell of home cooking. Nathan's parents hugged me immediately, not the stiff, obligatory hugs I was accustomed to, but genuine embraces that made me feel instantly welcomed. "So you're the girl who's got our Nathan checking out poetry books," his father teased, his eyes twinkling with good humor. His mother swatted her husband's arm playfully. "Don't embarrass them, Frank," she scolded before turning to me with a warm smile. "We're just happy he's finally met someone special." Nathan's siblings teased him mercilessly throughout dinner, sharing embarrassing childhood stories that had everyone laughing, while treating me as a member of the family right away. There were no sideways glances, no whispered comments, no feeling that I needed to prove my worth. "More potatoes, Rebecca?" Nathan's mother would ask, already serving me before I could answer. "Tell us more about your studies," his father would encourage, listening intently to my response as if what I had to say truly mattered. The time I spent at Nathan's house gave me a sense of family for the first time. There was no conditional love there, just pure acceptance. I found myself looking forward to those Sunday dinners, to being part of their easy banter and genuine affection. It was a revelation. This was what family could be, should be. Even after graduating from university and finding a job at a publishing house, Nathan and I continued to respect and support each other. Our relationship deepened as we discovered more about each other's dreams and values. It turned out Nathan was not just a garbage collector in the conventional sense. He was managing a waste collection company that he had taken over from his father, transforming it with innovative approaches to recycling and environmental conservation. "We are taking an innovative approach in the recycling sector," he explained to me one evening as we walked along the river near my apartment. The sunset painted the water in shades of gold and crimson, a backdrop to his enthusiastic gestures. "We've developed a method to recycle or compost 90% of the waste we collect. Most companies achieve less than half that." I was impressed by his passion and innovation. He lived by his beliefs, not by appearances or titles. That was one of the reasons I was drawn to him. He was sincere, hardworking, and unlike my mother and Howard, he loved all of me, not just the parts that were convenient or that fit a predetermined mold. He always listened to me and supported my dreams, whether it was my aspiration to become an editor or my desire to write a novel someday. When I introduced him to my father, they hit it off right away, talking for hours about books and environmental issues as if they'd known each other for years. "He's a good man," my father later told me, his approval evident in the warmth of his voice. "His eyes are full of love for you." Coming from a usually reserved father, this was high praise indeed. Vanessa's wedding. Around that time, my sister Vanessa got engaged. She was 20 years old, still in college studying art as my mother had always envisioned. Her fiance was an investment banker from a good family, exactly the kind of match my mother and Howard had dreamed of for their daughter. "Our daughter's wedding will be the celebration of the century," my mother proudly declared over the phone when she called to inform me, not invite me, just inform me. I could hear the satisfaction in her voice, the implicit comparison to my own modest life choices. They hired an expensive wedding planner immediately, sparing no expense to create the perfect event. I was invited, of course. It would look odd if the bride's sister wasn't present, but I was kept at arm's length from the planning process. Vanessa's wedding was lavish and splendid. Hundreds of guests in a grand ballroom, a reception at a luxury hotel, a designer wedding dress that cost more than my annual salary. Everything was perfect, from the cascades of white orchids to the five-tier cake adorned with edible gold leaf. My mother and Howard spared no expense to celebrate the special day of their real daughter. I sat at a table far from the main wedding party, watching the spectacle unfold with a strange detachment. The opulence seemed hollow to me now, a facade that concealed the conditional nature of the love that created it. During the reception, Vanessa found a moment to sit beside me, beautiful in her gown, but looking unexpectedly vulnerable. "Are you happy, Rebecca?" she asked, surprising me with her directness. "With your life, I mean." I considered the question, thinking of Nathan, my job, my father, the friends I'd made. "Yes," I answered honestly. "I am." Something like wistfulness crossed her face. "Good," she said, squeezing my hand briefly before being whisked away by another well-wisher. It was a small moment, but it stayed with me. Perhaps Vanessa too was beginning to see beyond the golden cage our parents had created for her. A heartfelt proposal. 3 years later, on a rainy night that drummed against the windows of Nathan's apartment, he invited me to dinner. The living room was transformed with candles that cast a warm glow over the space. A delicious aroma wafted from the kitchen where he had prepared my favorite meal, roasted chicken with rosemary potatoes, a recipe from his mother that he'd spent weeks perfecting. "What's the occasion?" I asked, noticing how he seemed nervous, adjusting the silverware repeatedly and checking his watch. "Can't I just make dinner for the woman I love?" He replied with a smile that didn't quite mask his anxiety. The meal was delicious, but Nathan barely touched his food, pushing it around his plate while maintaining a slightly distracted conversation about our days. As he served dessert, homemade chocolate mousse that wobbled slightly from his unsteady hands, I knew something significant was happening. After serving dessert, Nathan knelt down beside my chair and took out a small velvet box from his pocket. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing a simple but elegant ring with a small diamond that caught the candlelight. "Rebecca," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "you came into my life like a quiet miracle. You've shown me what it means to love someone completely, with all their strengths and vulnerabilities." He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving mine. "I want to walk through life with you, to build a future together based on respect and understanding. Will you marry me? Tears blurred my vision as I looked at this man who had shown me what unconditional love truly meant. Yes, I answered through tears that weren't of sadness but overwhelming joy. At that moment, my heart was filled with a happiness I once thought impossible for someone like me, someone who had grown up believing love always came with conditions. However, our engagement news was not received the same way as Vanessa's had been. While Nathan's family celebrated with genuine enthusiasm, hosting an impromptu engagement party the following weekend that filled their house with laughter and congratulations, my mother and Howard's reaction was painfully different. Confronting the past, a few days later, I visited my parents' house for the first time in 3 years to tell them the news. It was my first visit since Vanessa's wedding, an occasion that had highlighted the vast difference in how we were valued within the family. As I drove up the familiar driveway, I felt a strange mixture of emotions, anxiety, determination, and a surprising calm that came from knowing I no longer needed their approval to validate my choices. The house had not changed. The same manicured lawn, the same curtains in the windows, the same polished door knocker. But I had changed in ways that went far beyond the surface. I was no longer a frightened girl, but a woman confident in her own life, secure in the knowledge of her own worth. The realization gave me strength as I rang the doorbell, hearing the same chime that had once signaled my return to a place where I never truly belonged. My mother answered, her surprise at seeing me evident in the slight widening of her eyes. "Rebecca," she said, her tone careful, measured. "This is unexpected. I have news," I replied simply, stepping into the house without waiting for an invitation. My mother and Howard were sitting in the living room, the television murmuring in the background. Nothing had changed here. The same furniture, the same pictures of Vanessa dominating the walls, the same atmosphere of stifling conformity. I took a deep breath and shared the news of my engagement, watching their faces carefully. "Nathan and I are getting married in the spring," I said, my voice steady despite the rapid beating of my heart. "A garbage collector?" My mother's voice contained clear disdain. Her face twisted with surprise and disgust, as if I'd announced I was marrying someone with a contagious disease. "You're marrying someone like that? He's a wonderful person, Mom," I said, feeling a surge of protectiveness toward Nathan. "He runs his own company. It's an environmentally conscious business that's making real changes in waste management. No matter how you dress it up." Howard interrupted from his armchair, not bothering to stand or offer congratulations. "Ultimately, it's a job that deals with other people's trash." He practically spat the last word, his contempt unmistakable. His words hurt me, but I tried to remain calm, reminding myself that their approval wasn't necessary for my happiness. "He's a wonderful person," I repeated. "You would see that if you met him." However, neither my mother nor Howard was even willing to meet him. In their minds, my engagement was a disgrace that tarnished the family's honor, a poor reflection on them rather than a joyous occasion for me. My mother reached out to look at the engagement ring I was holding up, her face softening momentarily before hardening again. She scoffed at the small diamond, comparing it unfavorably to the massive rock that adorned Vanessa's finger. "Is this your worth?" she said, the words cutting like a knife. "Is my daughter satisfied with such a cheap thing?" I pulled my hand back, my thumb instinctively moving to touch the small diamond that represented not wealth but genuine love. "This is a symbol of love, Mom. It's not about the size." "Love?" My mother laughed, the sound brittle and hollow. "You can't live on love alone. What kind of life will you have with a man who collects garbage?" "You're wrong," I said, a lifetime of suppressed feelings finally finding voice. "Love is the most valuable thing to me. Nathan sees me, really sees me, for who I am, not who he wants me to be. Can you say the same?" My mother's expression turned as cold as ice, her posture rigid with anger and what might have been shame. "We will not attend the wedding," she declared with finality. "I have no intention of showing my face at such a modest gathering of losers." Those words were the last straw. I stood up silently and walked toward the door, my steps steady despite the storm of emotions within me. "Rebecca," my mother called out, her voice sharp with command. "Come back, we're not done talking." I turned around, meeting her gaze directly. "No, we are done. If you're not coming, that's fine." I have people who truly love me. As I closed the door behind me, I held back my tears until I reached my car. My heart ached with a familiar pain, but at the same time, it felt like the final trial in my life's journey, a painful but necessary severing of ties that had bound me to expectations and judgments that were never fair. That night, I called my father. I told him about my engagement and the reaction of my mother and Howard, my voice occasionally breaking as I recounted their cruel words. "Don't worry about it," he said, his voice a balm to my hurt. "They have always tried to impose their values on you, but you have the right to choose your own path, your own happiness." That weekend, my father came to my apartment to meet Nathan. He brought a homemade apple pie, still warm from the oven, and was warmly receptive to both me and my fiance. They talked enthusiastically about environmental issues and books, bonding like old friends despite having met only once before. As the night drew on, my father placed his hand on Nathan's shoulder and said, "Please take good care of Rebecca. She deserves all the happiness in the world." "Yes, I promise," Nathan assured him, his sincerity evident in every word. "She's the most important person in my life." As my father shook hands with Nathan, my eyes welled up with happy tears. Here was my real family, not bound by obligation or appearance, but by genuine care and acceptance. Before my father left, I walked him to his car, the night air cool against my skin. "Dad, do you truly bless our marriage?" I asked, needing to hear the words explicitly. He looked at me earnestly, his eyes reflecting the streetlights. "Does he make you happy?" he asked. "Yes," I answered without hesitation. "Then that's all that matters," he said, pulling me into a hug. "My wish is your happiness. It always has been." His words healed the wounds left by my mother's cold rejection. My real father had shown what a true parent looks like. It was an unconditional love, a love that prioritizes a child's happiness above societal expectations or personal preferences. Wedding preparations. Our wedding preparations proceeded with the help of my father, Nathan's family, and our close friends. It was modest compared to Vanessa's extravaganza, but it was filled with love, genuine love that emanated from every person involved. Nathan's mother helped me choose a simple but elegant dress. His sisters arranged the flowers, and my father insisted on paying for the reception venue, a charming garden with a view of the lake. "Are you sure you're okay with something this simple?" Nathan asked one evening as we reviewed our plans, perhaps remembering the opulence of Vanessa's wedding. "We could always." "This is perfect," I interrupted, squeezing his hand. "It's us. It's real." And Nathan had a surprise. He was actually acquainted with Paul McCartney, whom he had been a fan of since his youth. As it turned out, the former Beatle supported Nathan's environmental activities and had visited his recycling plant the previous year, impressed by the innovative techniques being implemented. "He's coming to our wedding," Nathan told me one evening, his eyes dancing with excitement at being able to surprise me. "Paul McCartney? The Paul McCartney?" I gasped, unable to believe what I was hearing. "You're joking." Nathan laughed, delighted by my reaction. "He's a big supporter of environmental causes, and we've kept in touch. When I told him about you and our wedding, he insisted on coming. Said he wanted to see the woman who captured my heart." On our wedding day, when a black car pulled up at the church entrance and Paul McCartney himself stepped out, all the guests gasped in collective shock. He greeted us warmly, as if we were old friends rather than a young couple he barely knew. "Congratulations, you too," he said, his famous smile as charming in person as on television. "Nathan's work is changing the world. And now I see he's found someone equally special." As a gift, he played a special song for us during the reception, an acoustic version of "Maybe I'm Amazed" that brought tears to my eyes and left our guests in awe. That wonderful moment transformed our modest wedding into an unforgettable celebration that no amount of expensive decorations or five-tier cakes could have matched. My father proudly walked me down the aisle, his arm steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "You look beautiful, Rebecca," he whispered just before we began our walk. "I've never been prouder." Nathan's family tearfully watched our vows, his mother dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, his father standing tall but with suspiciously bright eyes. In a space filled with love and joy, I truly felt surrounded by family for the first time, not the family I was born into, but the family I had found and that had found me. Social media storm. A few days after the wedding, I uploaded a photo on social media. The picture showed Nathan and I holding hands on the beach with Paul McCartney standing next to us, all three of us smiling broadly in the golden light of sunset. The caption read, "Best day of my life with my true family." The photo was meant to be a simple celebration of our special day, a memory captured to share with friends. I didn't think about how it might be perceived by others, especially my mother and Howard. Hours later, my phone started ringing incessantly. It was a furious call from my mother, followed immediately by an intimidating message from Howard. They were enraged by my post, their anger palpable even through the electronic medium. "You shameless person," my mother shouted over the phone, her voice so loud I had to hold the device away from my ear. "What do you think everyone will say when they see your photo with Paul McCartney making your wedding seem more lavish than Vanessa's?" I was taken aback by the accusation, the unexpected direction of her anger. It wasn't about my happiness or even my marriage, it was about appearances, about how my wedding might be perceived in comparison to Vanessa's. "Paul is Nathan's friend," I answered calmly, though my heart was racing. "He just came to our wedding because he supports Nathan's environmental work." "You are mocking us," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "Delete that post right now." "No," I replied, finding strength I didn't know I had. "This is a record of my happy day, my memories. I won't delete it to soothe your pride." My mother's voice became increasingly menacing. "If you don't change your attitude, you will lose your inheritance." I laughed then, a sound of genuine amusement rather than bitterness. "Mom, I didn't think you had anything left for me, but don't worry, I don't need money. I have true love, true friends, and a real family now." With that, I hung up the phone, feeling lighter than I had in years. The threats that once would have terrified me into compliance now seemed hollow and meaningless. What could they take from me that mattered? I had already found everything of value. Confrontation and liberation. That evening, as Nathan and I were preparing dinner in our cozy kitchen, the doorbell rang incessantly. We looked at each other in confusion before I went to answer it. Through the peephole, I saw my mother and Howard standing there, their faces contorted with anger. "It's them," I whispered to Nathan, feeling a momentary surge of anxiety. He squeezed my shoulder reassuringly. "We'll face them together. Let us in," my mother commanded when I opened the door, not bothering with greetings or pleasantries. I stepped aside and led them into the living room, a space Nathan and I had carefully created together, warm, comfortable, filled with books and photographs and the little treasures of our shared life. It was nothing like the sterile perfection of my mother's house, and I could see her eyes sweeping over it with thinly veiled disdain. Nathan came out of the kitchen and stood by my side, his presence giving me strength. He didn't speak, but his hand found mine, our fingers intertwining in silent support. "Delete that post," Howard demanded without preamble, his face flushed with anger. "Why?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "It's a memory of my happy day." "You are embarrassing us," my mother screamed, her composure shattering completely. "Everyone knows how wonderful your sister's wedding was, but Paul McCartney at your modest wedding ruined everything." "Mom," I said quietly, feeling a strange calm descend over me, "this isn't a competition. I am happy, that's all." I shared a photo of a special moment, not to make comparisons or to hurt anyone. "You have always been jealous," she accused, her voice rising in pitch. "Always envious of your sister. Now you're doing this to upset us, to make us look bad." I took a deep breath, feeling Nathan's hand tighten around mine. "Mom, I felt sidelined since I was a child. You've always prioritized Vanessa, my dreams, my hopes, my life. They were never important to you." "Don't be ridiculous," she retorted, her hands fluttering in agitation. "We gave you everything." "It was Dad who gave me everything," I said, the truth flowing freely now. "If it weren't for him, I wouldn't have gone to university. You saved all the funds for Vanessa." Howard's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Enough about your father," he spat. "He was hardly present in your life." "That's not true," I replied, memories of secret meetings and quiet support filling my mind. "He was always there quietly, without you noticing. He supported and believed in me, something you never did." My mother's expression changed then, a calculating look replacing the anger. Being acquainted with Paul McCartney means he's not just a garbage collector, is he? She said with a sinister smile. If you don't want to be disinherited, you better give us some benefit then. We can forget about this. We raised you after all. Just help us out with some living expenses, that's all. I felt a surge of disbelief at her blatant attempt at manipulation. Holding Nathan's hand tighter, feeling his warmth and support, I answered with a clarity that surprised even me. Mom, I have nothing to give you, and I don't want anything from you. Not money, not fake approval. I have a real family now. Nathan and his family, and Dad. They love me unconditionally, for who I am, not for what I can give them or how I make them look to others. My mother's face twisted with a mixture of shock and rage. Are you cutting ties with your family? You will regret this. No, I won't, I said, feeling each word as a truth I'd always known but never fully acknowledged. I have no regrets. This is my life, my choice, and I am happy. Howard glared at me, his contempt palpable. You're ungrateful. Have you forgotten everything we've done for you? I turned to Nathan, suddenly weary of the circular argument, of the accusations that had no basis in the reality I had lived. Nathan, can you ask them to leave? I said softly. Nathan spoke calmly but firmly, his voice steady and authoritative without being aggressive. I think it's best if you both leave now. As Rebecca said, this is our home, our life. Though my mother and Howard were furious, they no longer had the power to control me, to make me doubt myself or my worth. As they stormed out, slamming the door behind them, I felt a true sense of liberation for the first time, as if chains I had carried for decades had finally fallen away. Are you okay? Nathan asked when they were gone, pulling me into a gentle embrace. Yes, I said, surprising myself with how true it was. I really am. Reconnecting with Vanessa, several weeks after the confrontation with my mother and Howard, I received a message from Vanessa. Can we talk for a bit? Just us. Please. The hesitancy in her words was palpable even through the text message. We decided to meet at a small cafe midway between our homes, a neutral territory where we could talk without the shadows of our parents looming over us. I arrived early, choosing a quiet corner table away from the bustle of the lunch crowd. When Vanessa walked in, I was struck by how different she looked from her wedding day, less polished, somehow more authentic in her simple jeans and sweater. Thank you for coming, she said as she sat down, fidgeting with her wedding ring. I wasn't sure you would. Vanessa seemed more composed than I had ever seen her, a quiet dignity replacing the entitled attitude our parents had fostered. As we ordered coffee, I noticed the shadows under her eyes, the slight tension in her shoulders. I'm sorry, she said after our drinks arrived, looking directly at me for perhaps the first time in our adult lives. I always knew how Mom and Howard were treating you, but I never said anything. I was afraid of losing their love. The admission hung between us, heavy with years of unspoken hurt. I understand, I replied, surprised to find I truly meant it. Their love is conditional. You are brave, Vanessa, to acknowledge it. Vanessa smiled tentatively, a small but genuine curve of her lips. I want to be as strong as you, she said. You stood up to them. You built your own life. We talked for a long time that afternoon, the minutes stretching into hours as the cafe emptied and refilled around us. We spoke of past hurts and childhood memories, some shared, many not. We discussed the possibility of a new relationship, one built on mutual respect rather than the hierarchy our parents had created. My husband says I should have stood up for you years ago, she confessed, stirring her third cup of coffee. He doesn't understand why I let them dictate everything. We were both just playing the roles they assigned us, I said, reaching across to squeeze her hand briefly. You the golden child and me the outsider. It wasn't your fault. While a complete repair would take time, that afternoon was the first step toward building a new bond as sisters, one based on choice rather than obligation, on understanding rather than competition. New family dynamics, my relationship with my mother and Howard remained cold, but it was also a relief for me. Free from their control and judgment, I was able to fully accept myself for the first time. The anxiety that had shadowed me since childhood, the constant feeling that I needed to prove my worth, to be enough, began to fade like morning mist. Meanwhile, My relationship with my father deepened. Thomas was always on my side and remained an important part of my family. He and Nathan developed a close bond, often spending weekends working together on renovating our small house or discussing books over beers in the backyard. Your father is an incredible man, Nathan told me one evening as we watched Thomas drive away after dinner. The quiet strength he has, the way he loves you, that's what I want to be as a father someday. Nathan's parents also welcomed me as a daughter, treating me with the same affection and acceptance they showed their own children. For the first time, I lived in an environment filled with unconditional love, where my thoughts and feelings were valued, where I wasn't constantly measuring myself against impossible standards. Rebecca, taste this and tell me if it needs more salt, Nathan's mother would say when I visited, handing me a spoon and genuinely interested in my opinion. We're thinking of expanding the business into compostable packaging, Nathan's father would discuss with me. What do you think? Would the publishing house you work with be interested? These small inclusions, the everyday acknowledgement that I mattered, healed wounds I hadn't even known were still open. Unexpected crisis. A year after the wedding, I was building a stable and happy life with Nathan. His company was successful as a pioneer in environmentally friendly waste management, developing innovative recycling techniques that drew attention from across the industry. I had been promoted at the publishing house where I worked, editing books that inspired and moved readers. Our life was fulfilling, balanced, rich with purpose and connection. One day, an unexpected phone call shook my peaceful days. It was from Vanessa. Her voice trembled on the line, thick with unshed tears. Rebecca, it's serious, she said, her words tumbling out between muffled sobs. Mom and Dad have gone bankrupt. I grabbed the edge of the kitchen counter, steadying myself against the shock. What do you mean? Vanessa started to explain, the words pouring out in a rush of emotion. For years, my mother and Howard had maintained a lifestyle beyond their means to keep up appearances. Luxurious homes in exclusive neighborhoods, expensive cars traded in every 2 years, lavish vacations to destinations they could brag about at dinner parties, all financed increasingly by credit as Howard's real estate business faced setbacks. They had also continued to invest heavily in Vanessa's education and hobbies, determined that she would have the best regardless of cost. Mom always wanted to give me the best, Vanessa said, guilt evident in her voice. Ballet, piano, private schools, summer camps abroad, tuition for a prestigious art university, but in reality, it was far beyond their income. At Vanessa's wedding 4 years ago, they had spent an amount equivalent to a house mortgage, determined to create an event that would be talked about in their social circles for years. However, they did not change their lifestyle afterward and continued living lavishly, ignoring the mounting bills and declining income. The credit card payments became impossible, Vanessa explained. And last week, their house was foreclosed. They had to leave with just what they could pack in their cars. They had lost their home and were temporarily staying with friends, too proud to admit the extent of their financial ruin to most of their social circle. They can't ask anyone for help, Vanessa continued, her voice steadying slightly. Their pride won't allow it. But I can't support them alone. My husband is fed up with their wasteful habits and refuses to bail them out again. I was overwhelmed with complex emotions. For years, my mother and Howard had rejected and scorned me, dismissed my choices, and belittled the man I loved. Now they needed help, the very thing they had denied me throughout my childhood. Let me think about it, I replied, my mind whirling with conflicting thoughts. I need to talk to Nathan. A decision of compassion. That night, I had a long discussion with Nathan. We sat on our back porch, watching the stars emerge as I explained the situation. Nathan listened without interrupting, his face thoughtful in the gathering dusk. What do you want to do? He asked when I had finished, no judgment in his voice. I don't know, I admitted, wrapping my arms around myself against the evening chill. Part of me wants to say it's karma, that they're reaping what they sowed. But another part still cares. Nathan finished for me, understanding in his eyes. Despite everything, I nodded, grateful for his perception. Is that weakness? Nathan shook his head firmly. No, it's strength. The strongest people can choose compassion even when it's not deserved. What would you do? I asked, valuing his perspective. He considered the question carefully. I'd help them, he said finally. Not for them, but for you. So you never have to wonder if you made the right choice. So you never have to carry the weight of retribution. His words resonated with something deep inside me. The cycle of hurt and rejection had to end somewhere. Perhaps it could end with me, with this choice. We have the apartment above the office, Nathan continued. It's small but comfortable, and Howard might not like it, but there's always work at the company if he's willing. A few days later, I mustered the courage to visit where my mother and Howard were staying. The Friends guest house was modest compared to their former home, a stark contrast to the luxury they had surrounded themselves with for decades. I was shocked to see them. My once proud mother looked tired and aged, dressed in simple clothes instead of the luxury brands she had always insisted on. Howard was similarly subdued, the arrogance gone from his bearing, replaced by a defeated slump of his shoulders. There were no traces of their once luxurious life around them, just a few suitcases and boxes of hastily packed belongings. Rebecca, my mother said in surprise when she opened the door, her eyes widening at the sight of me on the threshold. I heard you're in trouble, I said quietly, not sure how to begin after our last bitter encounter. My mother looked away, embarrassment and anger warring on her face. Did Vanessa tell you? Her voice was a mix of resentment and shame. Yes, I acknowledged. She's worried about you. We're fine, Howard blustered from behind my mother, but the hollowness of the claim was evident in his haggard appearance. We'll bounce back soon. That's good to hear, I said, not challenging the obvious lie. But if you need anything, we can help. At those words, tears appeared in my mother's eyes, the first genuine emotion I had seen from her in years. Why? She whispered, the question containing decades of complexity. Because living with hatred is tiring, I said simply. Besides, I chose my words carefully, aware of the fragility of the moment. You're part of my past, part of what made me who I am today. That night, we had a long conversation about past wounds and future possibilities. We didn't reach a full reconciliation. Too much had happened for that to be possible in a single evening. But we made a step toward understanding. Patrick and I offered them temporary housing in an apartment owned by his company. I also suggested a job for Howard in the back office of Nathan's waste management company, handling accounts and paperwork rather than dealing directly with the collection aspects. A job in the waste collection industry? Howard said bitterly when I proposed it, his pride still intact despite everything. It's honest work, I replied evenly. And right now, you need honest work more than pride. He had no other choice, and deep down, he knew it. Howard accepted the offer and, to everyone's surprise, began working earnestly at Nathan's company. My mother adapted to a simpler life with less grace but growing resignation, gradually learning to live without the luxury items she had once deemed essential. Their material losses might have brought about some spiritual growth, some recognition of the hollow nature of the values they had built their lives around. It was too early to tell if the changes would be lasting, but there was a glimmer of potential, a small opening where genuine connection might eventually grow. Epilogue, Reflections. There's no such thing as a perfect family. We all get hurt, make mistakes, and learn from them if we're willing. Helping my mother and Howard wasn't just for them. It was for me as well. By letting go of anger and hatred, I found true freedom, a liberation more profound than any I had experienced before. Not bound by blood but connected by heart, bound not by force but by choice. I had created a family of my own choosing, people who valued me for who I was rather than what I represented or provided. And sometimes, relationships are reborn through forgiveness, not because the past is erased, but because we choose not to let it define our future. Sitting in my study at 45, looking at the framed photos on my desk, Nathan smiling beside me at our 10th anniversary, my father proudly holding our son, Vanessa and I laughing together at a recent birthday celebration, I realize how far I've come. My life journey began with a lack of love, but became filled with an abundance of it. And I learned that family isn't necessarily about where you are born, but where you are most valued. It's about who stays when everyone else leaves, who sees your worth when others are blind to it, who loves you not despite your flaws, but with complete acceptance of them. The greatest gift I've received wasn't the money for university or even the unconditional love of those who chose me. It was the understanding that I am enough, just as I am, a truth that no one can give you, but that you must find within yourself, often through the longest and most difficult of journeys. My name is Marian, and I started working in the financial industry nearly 20 years ago, not because I wanted a high powered career, but because I had to. My divorce left me with a 5-year-old son, Jake, and no support system except my own determination. My parents never seemed to have money or time for me, but somehow always had plenty for my sister Amy, who is 6 years younger than me. I remember the day I decided enough was enough. Jake needed new shoes for school. The soles of his old ones were practically falling off, and he'd been coming home with damp socks whenever it rained. When I asked my mom for help, you'd think I was asking for a diamond necklace. Marian, do you think money grows on trees? Mom sighed, her eyes narrowing as she reluctantly opened her wallet. Here's $30, make it work. You're always so resourceful anyway. $30 for children's shoes. I try not to show my disappointment as Jake silently watched the exchange, his small hands squeezing mine. Later that same day, I watched from my parents' kitchen window as they took Amy shopping. She came home with 3 new outfits, an expensive handbag, and a fancy laptop for job hunting purposes. I did the rough calculation in my head while washing dishes. They'd spent at least $1,000 on her in one afternoon. It wasn't a one-time thing either. When I needed help with Jake's daycare fees after my hours were cut at work, Dad made me explain exactly why I couldn't manage on my own before handing over the cash with a lecture about financial responsibility. A grown woman with a child should have better planning skills, Marian, he said, his voice laced with disapproval. You can't keep coming to us every time you have a problem. You're not a teenager anymore. Meanwhile, Amy would throw tantrums about needing money for rent, then post vacation photos from Miami Beach the next week. My friend Sarah, who I've known since college, owned a small financial consulting firm called Capital Solutions. One day, while dropping Jake off at her house for a playdate with her daughter, I overheard her talking about needing weekend help with some client portfolios. I could do that for you, I said, surprising even myself with my boldness. I did minor in finance before I got married. Sarah looked at me thoughtfully. You know, that might work. We could start you part-time and see how it goes. She hired me that day. I worked evenings and weekends while Jake was either asleep or at scheduled playdates. The pay wasn't much at first, but it was mine. I didn't tell my parents. I knew they'd somehow find a way to diminish my achievement or suggest I give the money to Amy, who was really struggling with her job search that had mysteriously lasted 3 years. For 2 months, I worked and saved. I moved out of my cramped apartment into a slightly better one, bought Jake new clothes, and even started a small savings account. For the first time since my divorce, I felt a sense of control over my life. Then came the day it all blew up. Mom and Amy walked into Sarah's office on a Saturday afternoon. I was behind the computer analyzing a retirement portfolio. The look of shock on Mom's face would have been comical if I hadn't been so terrified of the interrogation I knew would follow. Marian, what are you doing here? She demanded, her designer purse clutched tightly against her chest as if to protect it from the surprise of seeing her daughter working. I work here, I said simply, continuing to type. Have for 2 months now. Mom didn't say anything else. She just stared at me, took Amy by the elbow, and left. I knew dinner at their house that Sunday would be interesting. When I arrived with Jake, both my parents were waiting at the kitchen table, their expressions a mixture of confusion and something that looked oddly like calculation. Why didn't you tell us you were working at a financial firm? Dad asked immediately, barely acknowledging Jake's greeting as my son slipped off to play video games in the living room. I set down the homemade apple pie I'd brought and shrugged. I didn't think you'd care. You've always been more interested in Amy's career prospects. Of course we care, Mom said, though her tone suggested otherwise. She leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. How much are they paying you? The question hung in the air, its baldness surprising even me. When I told them I made about $3,000 a month between salary and bonuses, I saw something change in their expressions. It wasn't pride, it was calculation. Well, Dad said, clearing his throat, his fingers drumming against the faded tablecloth. Since you're doing so well now, I think it's only fair that you contribute to helping the family. Your mother and I aren't getting any younger, and our retirement savings aren't what they should be. I stared at him in disbelief, my hand frozen on the pie dish. What? Amy needs help with her rent again, Mom added, as if this explained everything. And we were thinking of helping her with a down payment on a condo. Those aren't cheap in this market, you know. That's when I understood. This wasn't about me contributing to my aging parents. This was about them taking my money to spend on Amy. Again, no, I said quietly but firmly. It's my money. I earned it. I'm raising a son alone, and I'm not giving you my hard-earned money for Amy's condo down payment. After that night, things changed. My parents did the bare minimum required by grandparents. They sent Jake a card on his birthday with $20 inside, bought him the cheapest clothes possible for Christmas, and occasionally asked how he was doing in school. Otherwise, I barely existed to them. When Jake had a piano recital at school, they claimed they were too tired to attend. When I was promoted to financial analyst, they didn't congratulate me. It was like I'd been demoted from daughter to distant acquaintance, and not a welcome one. Thankfully, I had Ruth, my former mother-in-law. Unlike my ex-husband Richard, who vanished after our divorce, Ruth remained steadfastly in our lives. She started coming to Jake's school events, cheering louder than anyone else's grandparents. She'd take us shopping occasionally and listen to my problems over Sunday dinners at her cozy house in the suburbs. You know, Marion, she said one evening as we sat on her porch swing watching Jake play with her neighbor's dog. I've never understood why your parents treat you the way they do. You're the most responsible, hardworking person I know. I sighed, watching Jake's carefree smile as he threw a tennis ball. I've stopped trying to understand it. Maybe they just connect better with Amy's personality. Ruth snorted. That's no excuse for parents to play favorites. You deserve better, and so does Jake. By the time Jake was in middle school, I was working full-time at Capital Solutions, having risen to senior analyst. I'd saved nearly all my money beyond our living expenses, applying for every professional development opportunity I could find. I knew career advancement was my ticket to financial security for Jake and me. On Jake's 13th birthday, my parents showed up for exactly 15 minutes. They took a couple of photos, then Mom checked her watch. We promised to help Amy pick out furniture for her new place. She's been so patient waiting for us today. They left before Jake even blew out the candles on his cake. But Ruth stayed. She whooped and hollered when Jake opened her gift, a refurbished laptop for his schoolwork, and took us out for ice cream afterward. 2 weeks later, at a rare family dinner at my parents' house, I decided to share my news. I've been offered a department head position at Apex Financial. I start next month. That's nice, Dad interrupted, not even looking up from his plate. More potatoes, Amy? I felt a familiar sting of disappointment, but pressed on. It comes with a significant salary increase and better hours, which will be good for Jake. My mother nodded absently, then turned to Amy. Tell Marion about your new volunteer position, honey. She's going to be helping organize that charity fashion show. As Amy launched into a detailed explanation of her unpaid work arranging table centerpieces, I realized I felt nothing. No anger, no disappointment, just nothing. I'd finally accepted that my accomplishments would never matter to them. The next day, I called Ruth. I'm thinking of moving to a better school district for Jake, I told her. The promotion makes it possible. That's wonderful news, she said warmly. I'm so proud of you, Marion. You've worked so hard for this. 2 months later, Jake and I moved into a modest 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood with excellent schools. Living with Ruth during the transition period was nothing like living with my parents. She treated me like an actual person instead of a burden, and Jake thrived under her genuine affection. I'm going to help you with the down payment, she told me one evening as we sat on her patio, watching Jake practice shooting baskets. Don't argue with me about it. Ruth, that's too much, I said, genuinely shocked by her generosity. She waved her hand dismissively. What else am I going to do with my money? My retirement funds are secure, and I intend to use what's left to help the people I love. You and Jake are at the top of that list. At Apex Financial, I thrived. I started as a department head, which basically meant I managed a team of analysts and took responsibility for our largest clients. I stayed late, came in early, and volunteered for the projects others avoided. My boss, Mr. Harris, noticed my dedication. After 3 years of nonstop work, I was promoted to senior director. With it came another salary increase, my own corner office, and more responsibilities. Instead of slowing down, I worked even harder, aware that as a woman in finance, I had to be twice as good to get half the recognition. Meanwhile, Jake grew into a thoughtful, intelligent teenager. At 16, he was already talking about college and career plans. Unlike me at his age, he had stability, support, and options. That was worth every late night and missed weekend. Mr. Harris called me into his office one day, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his expression serious. "Marion, I'm putting you in charge of the Griffin account." My heart nearly stopped. Griffin Enterprises was one of our biggest clients, known for being particularly demanding and having rejected 3 previous financial advisors. "Are you sure?" I asked, straightening in my chair. "Absolutely," he nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You've earned this chance. Don't mess it up." He smiled, but I knew he was serious. This account could make or break my career at Apex. For the next 3 months, I lived and breathed the Griffin account. I redesigned their entire investment portfolio, finding ways to increase returns while reducing risk. I spent countless nights at my dining room table surrounded by spreadsheets and market analyses, often falling asleep there until Jake would gently wake me and insist I go to bed. "Mom, you're working too hard," he'd say, concern evident in his young face that looked so much like mine. "It's just for a little while, honey," I'd reassure him. This account is really important. When I finally presented my plan to the Griffin board, they were silent for a full minute after I finished. The conference room felt suffocatingly quiet, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Well," Mr. Griffin said, his imposing frame leaning back in his chair, "finally, I think we found our financial advisor. This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we've been looking for." Not only did we keep their business, but they increased their investment with us by 30%. Mr. Harris was ecstatic. He called a company meeting to recognize my achievement, gave me a substantial bonus, and increased my salary again. That night, I called Ruth to share the good news. "I knew you could do it," she said proudly, her voice warm over the phone. "You've always been brilliant with numbers." "The bonus is significant," I told her. "I'm thinking of starting a college fund for Jake." "That's wonderful, dear," Ruth replied. "But please tell me you're going to do something for yourself too. You deserve a break. You've been working nonstop for years." "Actually, I am," I told her, excitement bubbling up. "And I've got something for you too." The next day, I visited Ruth with 2 envelopes. One contained a beautiful silver bracelet with her birthstone I bought as a thank you gift. The other held 2 tickets for a luxury Alaskan cruise. "You and me," I explained as she opened the second envelope in shock. "Next month, all expenses paid. Jake will stay with his friend's family. I've already arranged it." For the first time in my life, I saw Ruth speechless. Her eyes welled up with tears as she pulled me into a tight hug. "You wonderful girl," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve you." Our cruise was incredible. Glaciers, whales, northern lights, we saw it all. For 10 days, I didn't check my work email or worry about client portfolios. I just enjoyed being with Ruth, who at 75 still had more energy and curiosity than most people have her age. I posted photos on social media, something I rarely did, partly to remember the trip and partly, I admit, to show off a little. Look at us now. 3 days after we returned, my phone rang. It was a number I rarely saw on my caller ID these days. "Mom," I answered, genuinely surprised. "Marion, darling." Her voice was syrupy sweet, with a warmth I hadn't heard directed at me in years. "It's been too long. In fact, we were hoping you'd come over for dinner this Sunday. Your father is grilling steaks, your favorite." I should have said no. I knew there had to be a reason for this sudden interest in my existence after years of near silence, but curiosity got the better of me. "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. "What time? And is it okay if Jake comes too?" 6 o'clock. And of course Jake should come. "We've missed our grandson." The lies were so blatant I didn't even bother responding. I just told her I'd see them Sunday and hung up. That Sunday, I drove to my parents' house feeling strangely detached. Jake sat beside me, playing a game on his phone, occasionally glancing at me with concern. You okay, Mom? He asked as we pulled into the driveway. I'm fine, sweetie, I reassured him, though my stomach was in knots. Just remember that whatever happens in there, it's not about you, okay? The house looked exactly the same. Same faded blue paint, same flower beds that Mom obsessed over, same basketball hoop that Dad had installed for the neighbor kids, not for Jake. I'd offered to buy one for our own driveway years ago, but Jake had shrugged and said he preferred soccer anyway. Mom opened the door before I could knock, her smile wide and welcoming. Dad stood behind her, actually looking happy to see us. It was disconcerting. Marion, Jake, Mom exclaimed, hugging us both tightly. I returned the hug awkwardly, while Jake stood stiff in his grandmother's embrace, unaccustomed to such affection from her. You both look fantastic. Jake, you've grown so tall. They ushered us inside, offering drinks and appetizers like we were honored guests instead of family they'd barely acknowledged for years. The conversation was unnervingly pleasant, focusing on neutral topics like the weather and neighborhood news. Jake answered their questions about school politely but briefly, his eyes occasionally darting to me with confusion. Finally, when we sat down to eat, Dad cleared his throat, setting down his fork with deliberate care. So, Marion, tell us about your job. Sarah mentioned you're some kind of executive at Apex Financial now? As a department head or something? I carefully avoided answering my father's thinly veiled question about my position and salary. I knew exactly where this conversation was heading, and a familiar weariness settled over me. I'm doing well, I said vaguely, cutting a piece of steak that was far too overcooked. The company is great, and I enjoy the work. And Jake, Mom jumped in, turning to my son with exaggerated interest. How's school? Are you thinking about colleges yet? Before Jake could answer, I changed the subject. How's Amy doing? Is she around? The question worked like a charm. My parents' faces instantly shifted from eager to troubled, exchanging a quick glance that confirmed my suspicions. Actually, Mom said with a heavy sigh, smoothing her napkin repeatedly, Amy's having a bit of a difficult time. She had to leave that volunteer position. They just didn't appreciate her creative input. Dad jumped in, his voice lowered with practiced concern. And my business hasn't been what it used to be since I semi-retired. The economy's been tough on small businesses like mine. We're barely keeping up with the mortgage payments, and Amy's still living with us, you know. I put down my fork, the sound of metal against porcelain surprisingly loud in the sudden tension. I'm sorry to hear that. It must be difficult. They exchanged another look that confirmed exactly why I'd been invited to dinner. Mom reached across the table and took my hand, her eyes suddenly watery. Marion, honey, we know we weren't always the most supportive parents. We made mistakes, terrible mistakes. The way we treated you compared to Amy, it wasn't fair. I sat there, letting their words wash over me, studying the sudden appearance of remorse on their faces. Were they genuinely remorseful or just desperate for money? Probably both, I decided, but too little, too late. We're so proud of you, Mom continued, squeezing my hand with surprising strength. And we're hoping maybe you could find it in your heart to help your family, just until we get back on our feet. Your father's medical bills have been piling up, and with Amy still trying to find herself, there it was, the real reason for the sudden family reunion. I glanced at Jake, who was staring intently at his plate, clearly uncomfortable. I wanted to refuse, to tell them they'd made their bed and could lie in it, but something stopped me. Maybe it was Ruth's words about kindness not being weakness, or maybe it was the realization that I could afford to help them without hurting myself or Jake financially. How much do you need? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Relief flooded their faces, and Dad actually teared up, though whether from emotion or calculated effect, I couldn't tell. Just enough to help with the bills and the mortgage, maybe $1,000 a month. I nearly choked on my water. That was a significant sum, the same amount Ruth had given me for housing during my early career struggles. But my recent promotion and bonus meant I could manage it without compromising Jake's college fund. I can do that, I said finally, setting down my glass. I'll set up a monthly transfer. They both burst into tears, thanking me profusely. Jake looked at me with questions in his eyes, but stayed silent. I felt nothing, no warmth, no reconnection, just a vague sense that I was doing the right thing despite them not deserving it. When I told Ruth about my decision the next day over coffee at her house, she surprised me by nodding slowly. You know, there's a difference between being taken advantage of and choosing to help even when it's not deserved, she said, stirring her tea thoughtfully. You're a better person than they are. That's something to be proud of. I just don't want to be like them, I admitted. I don't want to turn my back on family, even if they turn their backs on me. Ruth squeezed my hand. Just make sure you're setting boundaries. Helping doesn't mean letting them drain you dry. Over the next few months, I saw my parents more frequently, occasionally joining them for Sunday dinners, sometimes with Amy when she was in the mood to grace us with her presence. She hadn't changed a bit, still self-centered, still treated like a princess by her parents. But what struck me most was her appearance. Despite their supposed financial troubles, Amy's clothes were designer brands, her nails professionally done, and she sported a new MacBook and iPhone. I didn't mention it. I kept sending the money each month, and my parents kept thanking me with over-the-top gratitude that felt increasingly hollow. Then they started asking for more, small amounts at first. The water heater broke. Could you help with $300? The car needs repairs. Would $500 be too much to ask? I rarely said no. My career was thriving, Jake was doing well in school, and I told myself it was just money. At work, I was assigned to lead a major project, restructuring our approach to corporate clients. If successful, it would likely lead to a vice president position. I threw myself into it, working longer hours than ever, grateful that Jake was old enough to be more independent. Finally, after months of work, my project concluded successfully. The CEO personally congratulated me, and the promotion I'd been hoping for came through. Vice President of Corporate Relations, with a salary nearly double what I'd been making. I bought an expensive bottle of champagne and drove straight to Ruth's house to celebrate. She answered the door in her gardening clothes, soil still on her hands, but her face lit up when she saw the champagne. I got the promotion, I announced, unable to keep the pride from my voice. Of course you did, she exclaimed, pulling me into a tight hug regardless of her dirty hands. Come in, come in. I want to hear everything. We sat on her back porch, drinking champagne from her best crystal glasses as afternoon turned to evening. The weight of achievement sat comfortably on my shoulders for once, instead of feeling like another burden of expectation. I'm so proud of you, she said, clinking her glass against mine. But promise me now you'll take some time for yourself. All work and no play isn't good for anyone, no matter how successful they become. I will, I agreed, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. I'm thinking of taking Jake to Europe next summer before he starts his senior year. And maybe, I hesitated, maybe I'll even start dating again. Hallelujah, she laughed, her eyes crinkling with genuine joy. It's about time. A week later, I made time to visit my parents for dinner. Jake begged off, citing a school project, but I suspected he simply wanted to avoid the tension that always lingered in my parents' house. Amy was home from whatever she did during the day, and I noticed she had a new designer handbag that probably cost more than my first month's rent in my post-divorce apartment. I got promoted, I announced during dinner, trying to share my accomplishment, a small part of me still hoping for genuine happiness on their behalf. A strange silence fell over the table. Mom and Dad exchanged that familiar look, the one that always preceded a request for money. Then Mom said, her voice carefully casual, you know, with your new position, you could probably afford to help us a bit more. Maybe $1,500 a month instead of $1,000. I laughed, thinking she was joking. I've already been helping for months, plus covering all those emergency expenses. Amy rolled her eyes, examining her freshly manicured nails. Don't be so selfish, Marian. It's not like you need all that money for yourself and Jake. You've always been so tight with money. Coming from her, with the $800 bag sitting next to her plate, it was too much. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it, bitter and familiar. No, I said firmly, placing my fork down with deliberate calm. The amount stays the same. The rest of dinner was tense, with disapproving glances from all three of them. I left early, unsettled by how quickly their gratitude had morphed into entitlement, but also oddly relieved. At least now I knew where I stood. Nothing had changed, and perhaps nothing ever would. Months passed. Amy finally got a part-time job at a boutique, a fact I learned when Mom called to invite me to a celebration dinner. She's finally finding her career path, Mom gushed. We're so proud. I agreed to go, more out of curiosity than any real desire to celebrate Amy's entry into the workforce at age 39. I arrived at their house expecting other guests, but it was just the four of us. Amy proudly announced she'd been working for 2 whole weeks and was planning to celebrate her career milestone with a luxury resort trip to Mexico. I need a break after all this hard work, she explained, scrolling through resort photos on her phone. Look at this infinity pool. Mom cleared her throat, setting down her wine glass with careful precision. We were hoping you might pay for Amy's trip as a sort of job congratulations gift. I stared at them in disbelief, my fork suspended halfway to my mouth. Excuse me? It would mean so much to her, Dad added, his expression earnest. After all her hard work getting this position. Amy nodded eagerly, showing me her phone. It's only $14,000 for the package I want. That's nothing for someone like you. I put down my fork, the metal clanking against fine china that my parents only use for special occasions. Amy hasn't earned a single dollar that wasn't immediately spent on herself. Why would I spend that kind of money on her vacation when I've been helping you with bills for almost a year? If you don't help your sister, Mom threatened, her sweet facade crumbling instantly, don't consider yourself part of this family anymore. I looked at them, my entitled sister, my manipulative mother, my weak father, and felt nothing but release. The last thin threads of obligation snapped clean. Fine by me, I said calmly, standing up and reaching for my purse. And by the way, I'm stopping the monthly transfers too. You can figure out your own finances from now on. As I walked to my car, I heard them calling after me, their voices shifting from anger to panic, but I didn't look back. When I got home, Jake was in the living room doing homework, and he looked up when I walked in. You're back early, he observed, his perceptive eyes scanning my face. Everything okay? Actually, yes, I replied, and meant it. I think I finally just freed myself from a very old burden. I immediately canceled the automatic transfer in my banking app, feeling lighter with each tap of my finger. For weeks, they bombarded me with calls and texts. I blocked their numbers. Emails came next, alternating between guilt trips and apologies. I filtered them to trash. A month after cutting ties with my parents and Amy, I received an invitation to Ruth's 75th birthday party. She was hosting a celebration at her house, inviting family members and friends from all over. I knew my parents would likely attend. She was still Dad's mother after all, but I figured we could avoid each other in a crowd. The day of the party arrived, and I dressed carefully in a blue dress Ruth had always said brought out my eyes. Jake wore a button-down shirt and khakis, looking startlingly grown up. I brought Ruth a hand-painted teapot I'd commissioned from a local artist, knowing her love for unique tea sets. When we arrived, the house was already filled with people. I spotted my parents and Amy immediately. They were standing by the buffet table, already filling their plates. They saw me too, but turned away without acknowledging me. That suited me fine. Jake and I made our way to Ruth, who was holding court in her favorite armchair, looking elegant in a purple dress with a corsage pinned to her shoulder. There's my girl and my handsome grandson, she said, her face lighting up as we bent to hug her. Always on time, always thoughtful. I gave her my gift, which she opened immediately, gasping with delight at the teapot. It's absolutely beautiful, she said, turning it in her hands to admire the hand-painted wildflowers. I'll use it tomorrow for my morning tea. The party progressed pleasantly enough. Jake found some younger cousins to talk to, and I chatted with relatives I hadn't seen in years, caught up with some of Ruth's friends, and successfully avoided any interaction with my immediate family. Then came time for dinner. The meal began cordially enough, with everyone passing dishes and making small talk. I sat with Jake at the opposite end of the long table from my parents and Amy, with Ruth at the head of the table. When the main course was served, People began offering toast to Ruth. My mother stood up, wine glass in hand, her voice carrying across the table. To my wonderful mother-in-law on her 75th birthday, she said, smiling broadly. You've always been a beacon of wisdom in our family, and we're so grateful for your guidance over the years. Her words were pretty but hollow, and I had to suppress an eye roll as I sipped my water. Then, to my horror, she turned in my direction, her smile tightening. And while I have everyone's attention, I'd like to address something personal. Her voice took on a wounded tone that I recognized all too well. My daughter Marion has recently decided that family isn't important to her. She's turned her back on us despite her financial success, refusing to help her own sister with a simple graduation gift. A shocked silence fell over the table. Jake's hand found mine under the tablecloth, squeezing tightly. My face burned with embarrassment and anger, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. Diana, Ruth said sharply, setting down her fork with a clatter. This is hardly the time or place. But I'd had enough. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Since my mother has decided to air our dirty laundry at Ruth's birthday dinner, let me set the record straight. I looked around the table at the uncomfortable faces. For the past year, I've been sending my parents $1,000 every month because they claimed they needed help paying bills and keeping their house. My father's cousin Martin, who worked at the bank where my parents had their mortgage, frowned and put down his fork. That can't be right. Richard and Diana refinanced their mortgage last year and reduced their payments significantly. I handled the paperwork myself. The table went utterly silent. All eyes turned to my parents, whose faces had drained of color. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. All this time, they'd been lying to me about their financial situation. I suddenly understood why Amy always had designer clothes and expensive accessories while supposedly struggling at home with our financially strained parents. You weren't using my money for necessary bills at all, were you? I asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. You were using it to continue spoiling Amy, just like you always have. Is this true? Ruth asked, her voice dangerously quiet as she looked at her son. My father stammered. It's not what it looks like, Mother. What exactly is it supposed to look like? I found my voice, shock turning quickly to rage. You took $12,000 from me under false pretenses in just a year. You made me believe you were struggling to keep your home when you were actually funding Amy's shopping addiction and planning luxury vacations. My mother tried to recover, her voice trembling. We needed that money for other things, family things. Ruth slowly stood up, her small frame suddenly imposing. Richard, Diana, I think you should leave. Now. Mom, please. Dad began, his face ashen. No. Her voice was firm, each word like a stone dropping in the silent room. You lied to your daughter. You took advantage of her success and generosity. You are no son of mine right now. She turned to Amy, who was staring down at her plate. And you, did you know about this, Amy? Amy's silence was answer enough. All of you, out of my house, Ruth continued, her disappointment palpable. And Richard, you should know that I will be revisiting my will. I have no intention of leaving anything to people who would behave this way. My parents and Amy left quickly, my mother in tears, my father red-faced with shame. The party dispersed soon after, guests making awkward excuses to leave early. Jake and I stayed to help Ruth clean up, all three of us working in contemplative silence. I'm sorry, I finally said, storing leftover cake in Ruth's refrigerator. I ruined your party. Nonsense. She patted my hand, her touch warm and reassuring. You didn't ruin anything. They did that all on their own. Jake, who had been quietly listening to everything, spoke up. Grandma Ruth, how come you're so different from Dad and the rest of them? Ruth smiled sadly at him. Sometimes people make choices that define their character, sweetheart. I chose to value honesty and kindness. Others make different choices. In the weeks that followed, Ruth told me my parents called her constantly, begging forgiveness and pleading with her not to change her will. She was unmoved. I already changed it, she informed me one afternoon over tea served in her new teapot. The house and most everything else will go to you and Jake. You're the ones who've shown real character in this family. I sipped my tea, feeling sad but relieved. I never wanted it to come to this. Neither did I, she sighed, gazing out at her garden. But we can't control other people's choices, Marion. We can only control our own. Jake adjusted beautifully to our simpler family circle. In fact, he seemed happier without the tension of my parents' conditional affection. We spent more time with Ruth, helping in her garden, taking her to medical appointments, and having Sunday dinners at her house. I started dating again, casually at first, then meeting someone who understood the value of honesty and respect. I haven't spoken to my parents or Amy since that day at Ruth's birthday party. Occasionally, I see their names pop up on my phone, but I never answer. Whatever they have to say, it's too late. Ruth was right. We can't control other people's choices. We can only control our own. And I've chosen peace.